From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the protest movement sweeping across Iran that some are calling a revolution. Initially sparked in mid-September by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini while held in custody by the morality police, the youth and especially women-led protests have since grown and spread across the country, morphing into something far broader, with protesters taking direct aim at the clerical regime itself. The crackdown by security forces has become increasingly severe, and the government has now begun executing protesters. According to figures from the human rights activists news agency, as of December 15th, nearly 500 protesters have been killed, and almost 20,000 people have been arrested. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. There's a lot to discuss on today's program, but thankfully we're joined by our good friend Alex Vatanka to help us make sense of things. Alex is the director of MEI's Iran program and a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative. He's also the author of the 2021 book, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States, Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. Alex, welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair, for having me. It's great to be back.
Alex, the protests began on September 16th. We're now 3 months in. Where do things stand?
Well, it's very clear that the anger in society that sort of led the people to come out is still very much there. I mean, if you just listen to various voices from the street level to celebrities, from football players to artists to actors and actresses, the anger is very much there. The Islamist regime led by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has not really been able to do anything, literally nothing, to diffuse the situation. It has nothing to offer this angry population. All it has been able to do is to rely on the old tactics of repression. It has worked to some extent. You can argue that if you're expecting this to be a revolution, well, we're not there yet. This is maybe the beginning of a revolution, but certainly the regime seems to have, as far as the security situation is concerned, it seems to have a grip on it. I don't get a sense that the regime fears it's about to fall, but I do sense, and this is, I think, is key, the regime knows and admits to itself that it doesn't really have an idea in terms of what to do next. Because while they might be able to contain the situation today, they know for sure they can expect more protests because that anger is so real and it's not going to go anywhere. And that's where they are at. That's where the regime is at right now. And I don't know what will happen in terms of their potential calculations and solutions to the problem. Because frankly, and this is something I'm sure we'll get into, what the demand from the protesters are not, small changes here and there to how Iran is run. The protesters are asking for regime change, a fundamental overhaul of the political system. And where the protesters and the regime potentially meet, if they can ever meet, remains to be seen.
It's hard to compromise with demands for the overthrow of the regime. I wanted to drill down on that specific issue a little bit more and just kind of underscore how protesters' demands have changed over time from kind of initial calls for justice for Mahsa Amini specifically and changes to particular policies to something far broader. What kind of chants and slogans are we hearing now? And what does that tell us about the kind of Iran that protesters want to see?
Alistair, if you go back, if you look at the last, say, 20 years, 30 years, you can go back as back as the early 1990s. Protesting has been part of life in Islamic Republic for one simple reason. The ruling elite either does not know how to or refuses to listen to the public. So they've been pursuing policies that the average Iranian just simply does not appreciate, does not accept. And these are policies that have created the dire economic conditions inside of Iran. And instead, what the average Iranian has had to witness is money that is increasingly hard to come by being spent on, foreign policy missions that frankly doesn't do any good for your average Iranian. So protests have been going on for a long time. If you go back a few years ago, your average protester might be saying things such as, let's have free elections. Let's have more representative system in this country. Let's think of maybe having a constitutional revision so the powers of the supreme leader, who is unelected, can be restricted somewhat. Those were the slogans of a few years ago. But as soon as this latest round of protests began in September, you heard very much a key demand, which is down with the dictator. And that dictator obviously is a reference to Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader since 1989, who is responsible for the state of affairs in Iran more than anyone else. I mean, I know Khamenei probably would like to blame various players in the regime and is looking for that scapegoat. But the simple truth is he's been there since 1989. And he is responsible more than anyone else. So that's why the protesters very early on, right, pretty much from when this began in 16th of September, have been going after him, which means they're not looking for adjustments anymore. They're not looking for gradual reform anymore because they don't think it's real. They don't think it's possible. They don't think Khamenei is a man capable of compromising. And that's why the slogans have been somewhat radical, certainly compared to before, and radical in the sense that the demand now is the end of the Islamic Republic and to be replaced by something entirely different, although it remains to be seen what that alternative system to come would look like.
Alex, what's the government's narrative about the protests? Has it changed at all over the past 3 months? And do you have any sense of whether it's resonating with the public, any segments of the public at all?
I see two sort of threads, to be honest, in terms of the regime's reaction so far. The first one is the usual reaction, which is borderline comical. It's denial, and it's this argument that this is all a foreign plot. I mean, if you believe some of the narratives that are coming out from the supporters of the regime, including pro-regime media, some 50 foreign intelligence services have come together and launched this campaign against the Islamic Republic. So that's the sort of thing you've heard before. This is all the doing of foreigners. The regime is innocent. It's never done anything wrong. People in Iran love it, and so on. But then look away from this, as I said, nonsense, refusal to accept reality. You do have figures within the regime, people like Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who's the Speaker of the Majlis, people like Ali Motahari, who used to be the Deputy Speaker of the Majlis being the Iranian parliament, or people like Ali Larijani, a former presidential candidate, another Speaker of the parliament. So, and I could go on. There have been a number of people who have come out and said, obviously we're doing something wrong. Obviously, things have to change. Obviously, the economy is not delivering for the people, and so on. So, yes, they're accepting that something is actually going on in Iranian society. Certainly, that's true among the younger demographic. This is a demographic from the ages around sort of 15 to 25. The regime openly has been saying for weeks they don't understand Generation Z or the Gen Z. They don't understand them. They know that these are people, the young generation that's been influenced by the world beyond the borders of the Islamic Republic. They are on social media platforms. They're connected. They see where the rest of the world is going, and they hate to see where they are as a country. And that's why they're out in the streets demanding fundamental change. So, right now, if you ask me, Alistair, this morning as I was reading Iranian media, I would say I didn't sort of detect panic. They don't think that, what happened to Muammar Gaddafi or Mubarak in 2011 is just about to happen to Khamenei. That fear is certainly not, seems to be there. But at the same time, I think it's hard to deny the fact, even if you're a regime supporter, that unless they change course, unless they can go back and look for ways to be at least try and increase the sort of level of acceptance of the regime, if not become more legitimate, which is a tall order. Unless they can do that, then this round of protests will be followed by more protests to come, because that is one of the undeniable trends. The demographics that are coming out, as younger they become, further away they are in terms of when they were born from 1979, less they seem to have time for the Islamic Republic. So somebody who was out and protesting in 2009 during the Green Opposition movement would have been much milder in their demands for political change. Today, we're hearing, the sort of slogans that, frankly, it's very difficult for me to point to any other time in recent Iranian history where the protesters were so angry and so adamant for fundamental change. And actually, not only are they have no hope about the future, but they're also fearless. And you spoke early on in the segment about 500 protesters being killed. The fact that people are still out in the streets in many locations around the country with 500 people having been killed tells you quite a bit. I mean, people are literally risking their lives coming out, but this is where they are today. They're so fed up and they have no way out, and the regime continues to essentially refuse to listen to them, that we have a pretty explosive situation on our hands still.
Indeed, Alex. Instead of offering an olive branch, the government's response, especially in recent weeks, seems to have been to kind of ramp up the crackdown, moving from kind of violent repression to arrests to now jail terms and even executions. What does that tell you, and where do you see things heading on that front?
It doesn't, Alistair, surprise me. This has basically been what they do. I mean, when they bring the cranes out and they start hanging people in public, this is a desperate sign of trying to deter future protesters. But the fact is, the state of Iranian society is such that you're not going to be able to kill your way out of this. And Khamenei, the 83-year-old supreme leader, who is by nature an extremely stubborn person. I mean, if you look at Khamenei's political track record, I bet you will find no examples of the man ever saying, "We made a mistake." He's not a sort of guy who is willing to accept either having made no mistakes or accept defeat. But there are plenty of folks, to my earlier point, around Khamenei who are thinking at the day when Khamenei is no longer here. They're thinking about their own personal and political safety. They're thinking about what if this does end up becoming a revolution, these angry masses will come looking for revenge. I mean, just look at recent years in places like Syria, where societies can collapse. And I mean, that would be a nightmare scenario, but not just a nightmare scenario for your average Iranians, particularly for the regime supporters, and particularly those ones who might have blood on their hands. They need to worry about their personal futures. And I think that probably, if I had to guess, is increasingly shaping calculations among the regime supporters. As I said, outside of the inner circle of Khamenei, I'm sure they're thinking about what do we do for us, because clearly this revolution has lost its way. It's no longer seen as legitimate. The younger generation wants fundamental change. We can continue to rely on repression as a way forward, but increasingly the evidence suggests that's not going to cut it. So what can you do other than repression? And I think the regime is at this point thinking about that collectively. They don't have good answers. Obviously, if they had, they would have by now introduced them. And there's no doubt there are splits within the regime. I mean, again, people sometimes in Washington want to pretend that the Islamic Republic of Iran is made up of individuals that have exactly the same political views. That is just not true. So yes, there are Islamists. They have been supporting the Islamic Republic, but there are differences in the commitment found inside the regime by members of the regime to the cause. And I think, there are plenty of people who are much more willing to accept the necessity of political change than was true only a few years ago.
Alex, I want to kind of pick up on that because I think that's a really important point. What do you think it would take for that kind of a division or split to come to the fore?
You know, one of the things the regime definitely, for sure, knew could create a deeper split in the regime is if they relied more on repression. Now, 500 or so individuals being killed is atrocious. And surely nobody can defend that. Particularly, so many of these are young individuals who have been killed, not to mention the thousands that have been arrested, and I'm sure in many cases mistreated, if not tortured, at the hands of this Islamist regime. So more repression could have put more pressure on regime figures and sort of forced them to choose if they wanted to continue being on this regime ship or whether it was time for them to jump off. The regime knew that was the factor they needed to fear. And I think that is why my sort of reading of the situation is they haven't been indiscriminate in the sort of killing of protesters. Now, I know listeners might say, what are you talking about? 500 or so people being killed. That isn't that indiscriminate? As I said, 500 too many, but the fact is they could have killed a lot more. And the fact that they have somewhat held back is because they know if they kill indiscriminately, then they're going to put pressure on players within the regime to choose whether they want to be part of this and being implicated in the death of young citizens of Iran, or whether they want to, break free and stop supporting the regime. And then the other factor here is that the young are the ones who've been in the streets mostly, and there's a silent majority in Iranian society that might not decide to come to the streets for whatever reason, but there's no doubt that in terms of their sympathies, they are with the protesters. So, again, there are no scientific data out there because surveys are not allowed. Independent surveys are not allowed in the Islamic Republic. But if you ask people like myself who watch Iran on a daily basis, we would tell you, anecdotally, what we have come to conclude is about 15% of Iran's population of 85 million people support this Islamist regime. And as the repression continues, as the economy continues to suffer, and Ibrahim Raisi, by the way, has done nothing but a horrendous job in terms of managing the economy. Inflation now is at highest levels we've ever seen, and people have no hope. Even if there's a nuclear agreement around the corner, that doesn't fix the economy. The problems that the regime have are structural. Most of it are to blame on the policies that are being implemented domestically. Corruption is rife and so on. So my point is, you could come to a situation where that silent majority that I was speaking about earlier decides actually they want to proactively support the protesters, the movement. Again, if that happened, if you do have more successful nationwide general strikes, you have more defections from the regime, then that becomes psychologically a point where it becomes impossible for many to stay with the regime because they will then put their own personal safety first. We saw that in 78, 79, last time Iran had a revolution. So many people who had been part of the state, part of the monarchy, supporters of the Shah, once they realized that the Shah's days were numbered, they jumped ship. We haven't come to that point yet, but I want this point to be very clear. There are plenty of people who are operating in an Islamic Republic of Iran today in various technocratic, bureaucratic positions who do it because it's a day job. They no longer believe in it in terms of an ideological cause, if they ever did. And if you got more pressure from society against the regime, it just becomes that harder for folks like that to sort of remain where they are. And they would be under pressure to, as I said earlier, to make a decision and maybe cut themselves loose from a sinking ship.
Alex, as you noted, we don't have public opinion polls, but we can certainly look to history for parallels. You touched on it now. I wanted to kind of expand on it a little bit more. We've certainly seen things that are quite reminiscent of the run-up to 1979, things like workers and bazaris going on intermittent strikes in support of the protests. As somebody who knows that era quite well, you've written about it extensively, obviously, including your most recent book. What do you see as the kind of key parallels and differences between 1979 and 2022 as of now?
It's a great question, Alistair. It is difficult to compare the monarchy of the Shah to the theocracy of Ali Khamenei. But, one thing that immediately comes to mind when we're trying to sort of make potential comparisons is that certainly critics of the Shah pointed out that from around year 1975, where the Shah banned all political parties and created a one-party system, that was, a pivotal moment that kind of really started galvanizing a cross-spectrum opposition against the Shah for what they called his absolute power grab. Now, something similar has happened over the last few years with Khamenei. In fact, you could make the argument that Khamenei has since 1989 very gradually worked toward this goal of making himself the only power that matters. It's called the Islamic Republic of Iran. There are supposed to be two parts to this system: an Islamist part, which means you sort of drive your legitimacy from claiming to base your policies in the holy book of the Quran and that you're doing God's work on this planet. The other part is a Republican component where you seek also legitimacy through elections. What Khamenei has essentially done is increase his powers, unelected office of the supreme leader, at the expense of the Republican component of the system. Elections no longer matter at all. We are at a point where in 2021, somebody who nobody can claim Ibrahim Raisi would have been a presidential candidate, never mind win. The reason why Ibrahim Raisi became president is because Khamenei had so much power, so much control over the system that he could just force his man, whoever he wanted, and he chose Raisi to be president. A symbolic position today. The president in Iran really has no power. And I can just point to the evidence we have in front of us. Where has Ibrahim Raisi been the last 3-4 months? He's irrelevant. He doesn't matter. He's a president in name with no powers. And this is to your point about making comparisons to 79. If the Shah was guilty of absolute power grab and that mobilized the opposition, you could certainly make the case that Khamenei has done the same thing now, that nobody is responsible for the state of affairs as much as he is, which goes back to the point of the slogans: down with the dictator, if not death to the dictator. They don't care about the parliament. They don't care about Raisi. They don't even care about the Revolutionary Guards. They care about the one individual, the whole responsible for where Iran is today, and that is Ali Khamenei, no doubt about it. And that's probably the one big comparison I could make. As I said, you cannot really compare the Shah with Khamenei. Two different individuals, came from different backgrounds, had different worldviews. But this is certainly on the idea of not being willing to share political power is one that I think you could make the argument there's some comparison. The other thing, obvious one, is the state of the economy. Now, in 75, Iran was doing pretty okay, but there was a huge disparity in terms of the haves and the have-nots in Iranian society. And you saw that being a major factor in mobilizing certainly the working class, the poor classes, even to some extent the rural classes back then in the 70s. Something similar is happening today for different reasons, because this time around it's you can again compare the two times, but the economic grievances are also a big part of why so many young people are agitated or angry and are willing to risk their lives to demand change.
Alex, so far we've focused exclusively on the kind of domestic factors, but I want to turn before we wrap up to the kind of international side of things as well. There have been a number of recent moves made in just the past week or so to kind of bring additional pressure to bear on Tehran over the protests and specifically over their response to them. The U.S. spearheaded a vote to remove Iran from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, citing its discrimination and violence. U.S. and Canada have imposed new sanctions on security and law enforcement officials. The EU's also imposed sanctions over the crackdown on the protest and Tehran's military support for Russia and Ukraine. The U.S. has blacklisted a Chinese firm for supplying video surveillance equipment. How significant are all of these measures taken together? Do you think it kind of affects any of the regime calculations? And I guess more broadly, do you think the international community is doing enough here?
Well, obviously, I think the international community has a role to play, certainly by keeping the attention on the behavior and the actions of the Islamist regime in Tehran. You might just make it harder for them to, for example, to go out there and kill more protesters and in the hope that they can get away with it. So scrutiny on that level might just shape some of their calculations, certainly in the short term as these protesters continue. And by the way, Alistair, I don't think these protests might have become smaller in size as compared to, say, 2 months ago, but they're not going to go anywhere. I think this is going to stay. This is going to be part of life. And Iranian protesters, certainly the young component of this protest movement, are working out ways to remain energized, remain mobilized, and remain in the streets to let their voices be heard and let their opposition to this regime be known. But in the short term, the Islamist regime of Ali Khamenei doesn't really seem to fear the actions of the international community. Their reaction to what just happened at UN, which you mentioned, being kicked out of the Committee on the Rights of Women, they just dismissed it as a political stunt by the West. They are used to being a pariah. So you can't shame them into changing their policies. Well, can you put pressure on them economically to change their ways? Well, this is the other reality. Iran is the second most sanctioned country on earth today after Russia. So there isn't really much else you can sanction. They'll learn to exist, to survive under the sanctions. There are scenarios that could be potentially very significant. For example, if tomorrow United States and China agreed that China is going to do a better job at respecting US-led sanctions on Iran, that would immediately have an impact on how much oil income they get. Iran today, based on their statements, they're selling about 1 to 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. Most of that goes to China. So again, that's not going to happen because US and China have their own differences over a host of issues. But you could imagine a scenario if China did want to put pressure on Iran. Yes, in that sense, the international community could bear more pressure on them in the hope that they can change their policies. But unfortunately, that's not where the international community is right now, certainly not when it comes to US and China and US and Russia. And speaking of Russia, the Russians, as the most sanctioned country on earth, are working with the Iranians, not just militarily, with the drones and missiles of Iran now going to Russia for the Ukraine war. But there's all sorts of promises of closer economic relations between Russia and Iran. And I just wonder if that's just going to be enough for Khamenei to say, I'm a good guy here. I've done nothing wrong. These people in the streets are paid by the foreign intelligence services. The West is trying to stop this revolution of ours that we began in 1979, but they're going to fail because I have potential partners out there, the Russias of this world, maybe the Chinas of this world, the Venezuelas of this world. And that might, in his mind, be enough in terms of justification to sort of stay the course and not pay too much attention to the criticism that's coming at the regime and its behavior from the international community.
Alex, we're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to get your outlook and final thoughts.
Look, I mean, I just want to say the last 3 months, and now we're entering the fourth month, Alistair, I've done plenty of lectures and given talks in the US and beyond. And the one question people ask you is this a revolution? And I've said pretty much from day one, I don't know if this is a revolution. All I can tell you is the trend speaks for itself. This is not going to be a problem that the regime can solve through repression. You have an Islamist government, a state led by 83-year-old Ali Khamenei, who has been in power for 30 plus years now, who has continuously refused to listen to their own people. And for a while that might have worked. But if I had to bet, and as someone who's watched Iran professionally for 22 years, I think the trend speaks for itself. This is just going to become a bigger issue. I think more and more people inside the Iranian regime are accepting that reality. And right now, we have to see if they can actually come up with any solutions to the problems they themselves have created and are responsible for the state of affairs in Iran. We'll have to wait and see. Again, if I had to wait for Khamenei, I would say it's not going to happen. his personality doesn't lend itself to that sort of a change of course. But my point is, there are plenty of folks in the regime that could look beyond Khamenei, and they now need to start thinking about their own perhaps futures and what they're doing to their own young men and women today, because this repression is horrendous and needs to be condemned across the board. And hopefully even people within the regime will start seeing the necessity to end this bloodshed.
That's all the time we have for today. But Alex, thank you very much for joining the program.
Great to be with you, Alistair. Thank you.
I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in and our podcast editor, Hans Fay, for his work on this week's episode. For all of the latest on MEI's coverage of Iran, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.